Hey guys, tonight we're going to tackle a topic you've definitely thought about, but maybe never out loud. What did people in the ancient world actually do when nature called? Spoiler, it wasn't pretty, and it almost never involved toilet paper. From squatting in the bushes to inventing the ancient equivalent of a public porta potty, our ancestors had to figure it out, one awkward accident at a time. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Let's begin at the beginning. Literally, before plumbing, before chamber pots, before even the idea of walls, there were humans, hairy, hungry, and desperately in need of a bathroom. But there were no bathrooms, just grass, rocks, wind, and the primal hope that whatever came out of you didn't attract something bigger and hungrier. You woke up in your Paleolithic camp, maybe somewhere in a grassy valley or a forest clearing. The sun's rising, the fire's out. You had mammoth meat last night, and it's time for the digestive consequences. There's no excuse me, no designated spot. You grab a stick, maybe a sharp one, maybe not. You trudge out a little farther from camp, squatting behind a bush if you're lucky. If not, just anywhere. But it's not just about going. It's about not being eaten while doing it. You're in the most vulnerable position possible. Pants off, knees weak, arms trembling, eyes scanning the tree line for wolves, snakes, or other early risers who want to share your spot. This is the earliest form of defensive pooping, a survival skill no one wrote down, but everyone instinctively knew. Never let your guard down when your butt is out. In toilet paper? Not even a concept. You used whatever was around. Leaves, moss, smooth rocks. If you lived near a river, maybe even a handful of wet sand. Anything that didn't give you an infection immediately. And if you chose the wrong leaf, like stinging nettle or poison ivy, you found out very quickly. Let's take a moment to talk about wiping, because wiping is a luxury we barely appreciate. Modern humans have options: paper, wipes, bidets. Ancient humans had their hands, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, and not always the clean hand either. In some cultures, this gave rise to a designated dirty hand, usually the left, and the social etiquette to match. If someone offered you food with their left hand in ancient Mesopotamia, congratulations, you just lost your appetite. But even in early societies, people started to realize that leaving your business just anywhere caused problems. Not just "it smells bad" problems, but serious ones. Flies, disease, someone stepping in it at dawn. So humans began developing poop protocols. The first public sanitation was probably just go over there, far away from the water and our food. It was a basic principle that even wild animals follow. Don't poop where you eat. And if you did, someone probably yelled at you, even if language hadn't been invented yet. As small bands became villages and villages became cities, the ancient toilet problem only got worse. With more people came more poop, much more, and no infrastructure. The first urban centers in places like Çatalhöyük or early Sumer likely smelled horrific. Imagine hundreds of people all squatting outside their homes with no drainage, no privacy, and zero shame. A society built on clay bricks and collective discomfort. Now, in case you're wondering, yes, some groups took it a step further. Archaeologists have found latrines from as early as 3000 BCE. That's right, we've uncovered ancient poop pits, complete with fossilized feces, called coprolites, which tell us not only where people did their business, but what they had for dinner. Spoiler, it was usually barley, goat meat, and sadness. In places like the Indus Valley civilization, we see some of the first real bathrooms, little rooms with drains that led away from the house. That's right, folks. Around 2500 BCE, some people in what's now Pakistan had better bathroom setups than your friend Dave's broken guest toilet. These weren't flush toilets, but they were consistent, cleanable, and, most importantly, not in the kitchen. Meanwhile, other cultures took a more relaxed approach. Ancient Egyptians, for instance, used toilet stools, literally a small seat with a hole, placed over a sand-filled pot. You did your business, covered it with sand like a polite desert cat, and someone later came to dump it outside the city. Who was that person? A hero, a tragic, underpaid hero. And then there were the nomads, the people who moved constantly, chasing game, avoiding drought, escaping other people's bad hygiene. For them, the bathroom was wherever the horizon wasn't. But even nomads learned to be careful. You buried it if you could, you burned it if you were desperate. And sometimes, if you were really unlucky, you sat down too fast and discovered a scorpion had the same idea. Let's not forget the children. In every era, children are messy. Paleolithic kids didn't have diapers, they just went wherever they stood. Parents watched closely, not because they could stop it, but because knowing it happened was half the battle. In some early tribes, babies were wrapped in absorbent moss and hide, a sort of prehistoric diaper that had to be changed constantly or, more often, just burned. Even in early religious life, bathroom habits mattered. Ritual cleanliness wasn't just about washing your hands, it was about not contaminating sacred spaces with your unholy bodily functions. Some early temples had strict rules. Go relieve yourself far away, wash with water or sand, and come back only when you're spiritually and physically cleansed. If you ignored the rule, you weren't just gross, you were blasphemous. But the best part? Nobody ever talked about this in the scrolls. No one carved stone tablets saying, "Remember to dig a hole before you squat." Ancient art rarely includes someone mid-poop, and yet it was something every human dealt with. From kings to servants, from priests to hunters, everyone had to squat somewhere, and you can bet it was never elegant. In fact, some ancient stories and jokes did survive. One Sumerian proverb, literally one of the oldest written jokes in history, is about a man farting in his friend's face and then denying it. The joke, timeless. The method, gross. The point, they were just like us. And while some cultures tried to pretend that bodily functions were shameful, others embraced them. Ancient Greek comedies, full of poop jokes, Roman graffiti, bathroom humor everywhere, medieval monks, wrote entire poems about bad smells in the latrine. It wasn't always highbrow, but it was honest. So the next time you walk into a clean bathroom with running water and a locking door, take a moment to thank the thousands of generations before you, who suffered through mud, sticks, cold mornings, and questionable leaves, all so you could enjoy two-ply comfort and peace. But don't get too comfortable, because in part 2 we're diving into the rise of ancient city sanitation, where things get organized, then overrun, and then somehow worse. Chamber pots, street dumps, Roman sponge sticks, yes, they existed, and the glorious, disgusting mess of urban hygiene awaits. By the time humans figured out farming and started building cities, something else started piling up at an alarming rate. Waste. And not just the metaphorical kind, the literal kind, human waste. Because if everyone's living close together, eating grain-heavy diets and drinking questionable water, it's not long before someone has to ask the awkward question, so, where is it all supposed to go? Welcome to ancient city life. Packed streets, no plumbing, and a public health crisis that nobody had a degree for. Let's begin with the chamber pot, arguably humanity's most desperate compromise. This humble object was essentially a bowl you did your business in. Ceramic, metal, wood, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was in your room, under your bed, or sometimes just in the corner. Privacy, optional, ventilation, non-existent. In the morning, someone, often the youngest, lowest status member of the household, had to carry the full chamber pot somewhere. Where exactly? A question for the ages. Maybe a field, maybe the river, maybe just out the window. Yes, really. In places like medieval Paris and ancient Rome, it was totally normal to dump your chamber pot into the street, but only after yelling "Gardilou," or the Latin equivalent, which roughly translates to, "Heads up, the sky is about to poop." Now imagine walking those streets, cobbled alleys, ankle deep in runoff, rain mixing with other liquids. You wore wooden platform shoes, not for fashion, but to avoid catching dysentery through your toes. It's no wonder that medieval cities constantly reeked of death, sweat, and something that might have once been a turnip. And this wasn't just a European thing. Ancient Chinese cities, bustling Maya marketplaces, and Middle Eastern trade hubs all faced the same crisis. Too many people. Not enough holes in the ground. But let's rewind to ancient Rome for a moment, because if there was one civilization that tried to turn pooping into a public art form, it was the Romans. Roman public latrines were communal, not stalls, not private. Picture a long stone bench with multiple keyhole-shaped holes carved side by side. You and your fellow citizens would sit together, robes hiked up, chatting about gladiator fights, the weather, and maybe who owed you money, all while everyone took care of business in full view. It was, essentially, the original open office plan, with more smells. And let's talk about the infamous Roman sponge on a stick, or tersorium. You did your business, then used this communal sponge, attached to a wooden handle, to clean yourself. Then you rinsed it in a gutter of running water under the seat and placed it back in the pot for the next person. Yes, communal sponge, shared, with everyone. The same people who built aqueducts, perfected cement, and ran an empire stretching across 3 continents. Also said, yeah, one sponge for all of us sounds sanitary. Diseases spread quickly, parasitic infections, gastrointestinal nightmares, and good old-fashioned butt rash. Historians now think Roman bathhouses were less a place for hygiene and more like bacteria speed dating centers. You came out dirtier than you went in, but at least you were exfoliated. And it wasn't just the toilets. The sewer systems, like Rome's Cloaca Maxima, were feats of engineering brilliance designed to move waste away from the city center. Except, and this is important, they didn't filter anything. So where did all that carefully diverted waste go? Straight into the Tiber River, which also happened to be the water source for laundry, bathing, cooking, and drinking. It was a circle of life, a very stinky, parasitic circle. In ancient China, things were slightly more pragmatic. The Chinese developed night soil collection systems. People pooped in buckets. Those buckets were emptied by collectors, and the waste was transported to rural farms as fertilizer. That's right, your leftovers became someone else's crop booster. Efficient? Yes. Sanitary? Questionable. But you had to respect the cycle. Use, remove, grow, repeat. Night soil collectors were not glamorous. They worked at night, obviously, carrying heavy, sloshing buckets through dark alleys. People avoided them not just because of the smell, but because it was considered low status, bordering on spiritually unclean. You weren't just hauling poop, you were basically ghost adjacent. Back in medieval Europe, things weren't so cyclical. People just dumped it and hoped for the best. In castles, you might find a garderobe, a stone seat built over a shaft that dropped waste into the moat below, which sounds fine until you realize castle moats weren't filled with sparkling water. They were essentially open sewers, attracting rats, frogs, and a special kind of smell that could end friendships. In city homes, if you were lucky, you had a privy, a hole in the backyard. If not, you used the alley, or a stairwell, or again, a bucket. Some places passed laws trying to stop this. No dumping between sunrise and sunset. Don't throw waste into public fountains. Please stop defecating in churchyards. But enforcement was hard when the police had to walk through the same mess as everyone else. Let's take a moment to appreciate ancient toilets in luxury contexts. In ancient Crete, the Minoans had flushing toilets. Actual flushing. Gravity-fed water systems cleared the waste, taking it to drains far from the house. These were built around 1700 BCE. Meanwhile, in some parts of 19th century London, people were still pooping in buckets and flinging it into the Thames. Speaking of London, by the time cities exploded during the Industrial Revolution, things got catastrophic. But we'll save that for part 3. Let's close this part with a tribute to the real heroes of ancient bathroom culture, the quiet, unsung janitors of human history, the dung sweepers, the pot scrubbers, the anonymous souls who emptied chamber pots, scrubbed latrine seats, and carried the weight of civilization. Literally. They didn't write the scrolls or build the temples, but without them, ancient cities would have drowned in their own filth within weeks. And sometimes, they did. By now, you've survived the prehistoric poop pits and the communal sponge sticks of Rome. But don't relax just yet, because now we're entering the fragrant hellscape that was early modern Europe. A time when cities got bigger, sanitation got worse, and bathrooms began to rebel against their creators. Let's begin with a simple question. What happens when everyone in a city uses a chamber pot, and nobody picks them up? Welcome to London, circa 1650. You live in a 3-story timber home that's barely standing. You share your bed with 2 siblings, and your chamber pot is currently fermenting under the bed. You'd like to empty it, but it's raining. The street is ankle deep in horse manure, and honestly, you just don't care anymore. So what do? You open the window, yell "Gardez-le," French for "look out for the water," which everyone knew was code for human waste incoming, and you launch it. if someone was unlucky enough to walk underneath, well, that's their fault for not listening. This wasn't just a one-off event. This was every day. The streets of London, Paris, and other bustling European cities were open sewers, rivers of mud, urine, feces, rotting vegetables, blood from butchers' shops, and whatever else people didn't want in their homes. The result? Stench. Unbelievable, unholy, unrelenting stench. Rich people carried little bouquets of flowers or perfumed handkerchiefs to press against their noses. Poor people just suffered and occasionally passed out. Doctors believed bad smells, miasmas, caused disease. So instead of removing the waste, they tried to cover up the smell. The logic, if it doesn't smell bad, it can't kill you. Spoiler, it still killed you. The Black Death? Partly blamed on foul air. Cholera? That came later and also got blamed on bad vapors. Meanwhile, the real problem, the water supply, was quietly being poisoned by everyone's bathroom habits. Let's talk about the water for a moment. People drew drinking water from rivers, wells, and public fountains, which sounds fine, until you realize chamber pots were being dumped into the exact same places. It was the worst cycle imaginable: drink, digest, dump, repeat. And yet, indoor plumbing existed, kind of. In some wealthier homes, you had what was called a close stool, a wooden box with a padded seat and a chamber pot hidden inside. It was the ancestor of the modern toilet. Royalty had fancy versions covered in velvet, for something meant to absorb moisture. But still, the problem remained. Someone had to empty it. If you were rich, you had a gong farmer. That was the job title. These poor souls worked at night, shoveling human waste from cesspits and privies. Gong farmers were paid well, but shunned by society. They couldn't live near others. Their clothes were often burned after shifts, some of them literally drowned in sewage. That's not a metaphor. That's a historical record. And those cesspits? Oh, they exploded, that's right. Methane buildup in underground pits occasionally ignited, sometimes from candles, sometimes from sheer spite, and boom. A latrine would detonate, sending decades of human waste into the sky. One famous case in 1623 saw multiple people killed in England when a cesspit under a crowded outhouse blew up during a church meeting. That's how powerful toilets became, literal weapons of mass disruption. But even when things weren't exploding, they were quietly ruining lives. Apartment dwellers in early Paris sometimes had no access to a privy, so they used buckets, or just corners. Tenement buildings might have one shared outhouse for 40 people. At night, it became a game of how long can you hold it? The answer was, not long enough. Street cleaners, called rakers, did what they could, hauling away solid waste by cart. But corruption was rampant, and many cities simply didn't enforce sanitation rules. London even had open drainage ditches called kennels, essentially rivers of poop between streets and sidewalks. You stepped over them, fell in them, and prayed you didn't drop your bread. And yet, this was normal. It was so normal that people just stopped noticing. Visitors from cleaner parts of the world, like parts of the Islamic world or East Asia, were horrified. In places like Ottoman Istanbul or Imperial China, public baths, sewer systems, and waste collectors made European cities look like compost heaps on fire. Meanwhile, in France, nobles took things to new levels of absurdity. The Palace of Versailles, gilded, opulent, glorious, had no bathrooms. Guests and staff would literally relieve themselves behind curtains, in hallways, in fireplaces. Chamber pots overflowed. Royal gardeners complained that the palace stank worse than the stables. Toilets were seen as low class. Using one meant you didn't have enough servants to carry your waste away. Even Marie Antoinette, yes, that Marie, had a porcelain commode with gold trim, but it was symbolic. Most nobles still preferred a servant, a bucket, in the vague hope that the smell would go away on its own. Let's also talk about etiquette. In Elizabethan England, it wasn't uncommon for a gentleman to excuse himself during a dinner party and simply urinate into the fireplace. It was warm, discreet, and vaguely theatrical. Outdoor banquets came with a row of bushes for the men and a polite corner for the ladies. Privacy was a luxury, dignity was optional, and women, they had it worse. Navigating layers of skirts, corsets, and petticoats in a freezing stone privy was a logistical nightmare. Some carried bordeleus, small, oval-shaped porcelain pots that could be discreetly used under skirts, basically a portable urinal, popular at church, which raises many questions. Meanwhile, toilet paper still didn't exist. People used moss, hay, wool, rags, corn cobs, and in one French prison, live ferrets. No, we don't know why. We don't want to know. The point is, anything could be a wiping implement if you were desperate enough. And in public life, it wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Thieves would wait near public latrines to rob distracted users. Some even pushed people in. Falling into a cesspit meant serious injury or death. People went armed just to take a dump. So why didn't people fix it? Well, they tried, sort of. But most solutions were local, inconsistent, and deeply flawed. No one wanted to pay for public toilets. No one wanted to haul waste. And certainly no one wanted to admit that the city's biggest enemy wasn't war, disease, or politics, but poop. By the end of the 18th century, things reached a tipping point. People were dying, rivers were poisoned, and the smell was affecting trade. Something had to change. By the 1800s, the human race had spent thousands of years improvising its way around one of the most basic facts of life. We all poop, and we need a place to put it. And for most of history, the solution was anywhere but here. But then cities exploded in size, millions of people packed into neighborhoods designed for thousands. And suddenly, the old tricks, chamber pots, cesspits, and praying the river carries it all away, weren't just gross, they were deadly. Welcome to Victorian London, the city that finally broke under its own stench. By 1858, the Thames River was no longer a source of life. It was a shimmering brown ribbon of pure horror, choked with industrial runoff, dead animals, and a soup of human waste from over 2 million people. The air reeked of sulfur, rot, and something nobody could quite describe without crying. That summer was so hot the river steamed. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Stink. Parliament tried to carry on, but the smell was so bad they soaked curtains in vinegar and held meetings with handkerchiefs over their faces. Eventually, they gave up and went home. Imagine the government literally evacuating because the toilet overflowed. Meanwhile, cholera was running wild. The disease spread like a rumor in a gossip club, sudden, vicious, and fatal. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out in days. At first, doctors blamed miasma again, bad air from bad smells. But then came Dr. John Snow, no relation to the one who knows nothing. Snow suspected the water, not the air, was to blame. After a particularly brutal cholera outbreak in Soho, he mapped infections and traced them to a single water pump on Broad Street. He removed the pump handle. The outbreak stopped. Just like that, Snow proved that the cause wasn't foul air, it was foul water, germs, bacteria, tiny monsters swimming in what people were drinking, cooking with, and baptizing their babies in. This was a revelation, and an embarrassment. Suddenly, all those riverside dumps and urban cesspools weren't just unsightly. They were murder weapons. The city had to act. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, engineer, genius, absolute sanitation legend. Bazalgette designed a vast system of underground brick-lined sewers that would carry waste away from London and dump it far downstream, where at least the fish could die in peace. It was the largest civil engineering project of its time. 135 miles of sewers, all gravity-fed, all brilliantly planned. He even made the pipes twice as wide as needed, saying, "We're only going to do this once." And he was right. Many of those pipes are still in use today. Bazalgette didn't just build sewers, he saved millions of lives, literally. Once London stopped drinking its own filth, cholera cases plummeted, infant mortality dropped. The air still smelled terrible, but people were less likely to die from it. But even as the pipes improved, the toilets themselves were having a moment. Let's rewind to a man named Sir John Harington, godson of Queen Elizabeth I, who, in 1596, invented the first real flush toilet. It worked, kind of. It used water and gravity to flush away waste. He even installed one for the Queen, but like all things ahead of their time, it was ignored for centuries, because nobody wanted to pay for plumbing. And besides, what was wrong with the good old bucket system? Fast forward to the 19th century. With pipes finally under the streets and water supplies improving, flush toilets became the new obsession of the upper class. Designers competed to make them more efficient, more decorative, and more explosive. Yes, explosive. Early toilets often vented sewer gas back into the home. Without proper U-bends or traps, methane would build up inside the bowl. Then someone would walk in with a candle and boom, death by toilet fire. It happened enough times that plumbing codes had to be invented. Toilets became less beautiful and more safe, which is probably for the best. Meanwhile, toilet paper finally made its entrance. For centuries, wiping was a creative endeavor. Rags, corn cobs, moss, stones, seashells, yes, and your left hand, in many cultures, still considered unclean for that reason. But in 1857, Joseph Gaiety sold medicated paper in sheets, proudly advertising it as protection against hemorrhoids. Unfortunately, it had his name printed on each sheet, so yes, you literally wiped with the inventor's name. Toilet paper caught on slowly. People were attached to their moss and newsprint, but as plumbing improved, so did wiping habits. Soft rolls appeared in the 20th century, and the modern bathroom finally started to resemble the thing we take for granted today. And yet, even today, over 3.5 billion people live without modern toilets. Entire cities in developing nations still struggle with waste management. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery are alive and well in places where the sewer never arrived. The toilet, it turns out, is not just a convenience. It's infrastructure, it's dignity, it's survival. Which brings us full circle, because while we laugh at chamber pots and Roman sponges, the real history of going to the bathroom is a story of adaptation, desperation, and the long stinking journey toward not dying every time you pee. From squatting in a prehistoric bush to scrolling your phone on a porcelain throne, it's taken humanity tens of thousands of years to figure this out, and even now, we're still working on it. Tonight, we're diving into the gloriously unglamorous, back-breaking, soul-crushing reality of Roman slavery, where the motto was, do everything, own nothing, and smile for your master unless you want to get flogged. Think slavery in ancient Rome was just sweeping floors in a toga and occasionally fanning a senator? Think again. It was misery with a side of olive oil. Let's start with a fun fact. At its peak, 1 in 3 people in Rome was a slave. That's not a metaphor. That's the census. If you walked through a Roman street, odds are every third person you passed didn't legally exist as a human being. Just property, breathing equipment with a pulse. The empire's power wasn't built on marble columns and aqueducts. It was built on human suffering, with excellent engineering. So, what did Roman slaves actually do all day? Well, it depends on which kind of slave you were, because in the wonderfully efficient hellscape that was Roman society, slavery came in all flavors, from miserable dirt-covered field worker to miserable perfumed house servant. Let's begin with the lowest tier of torment, agricultural slaves, also known as human mules with worse health care. These were the ones shackled on vast estates, called latifundia, waking up before dawn and going to bed just after collapsing from exhaustion. They plowed, planted, harvested, and died. That was the whole resume. A typical day for an agricultural slave began before the sun showed up, because of course it did. You got up in the dark, muscles already aching from yesterday, and started preparing tools. No one cared if your back hurt, if your hand was infected, or if you were coughing up blood. You had work to do. And if you were slow, there was always the overseer, armed with a whip and zero empathy. Slaves weren't paid, they were beaten for motivation. Breakfast? If you were lucky, a hunk of coarse bread and some water. If you were very lucky, maybe a smear of olive mash that used to be olives before it got stomped out of usefulness. You didn't sit to eat, you shoved it in your mouth while trudging out to the fields. Once you arrived, it was hours of labor, picking olives, tilling soil, carrying baskets of grapes, threshing grain. No shoes, no gloves, no rights. The Roman economy was hungry, and your suffering was the fuel. Need a break? Too bad. Fall over? Get dragged up. Complain? That's adorable. Try it and see how fast you lose teeth. Some agricultural slaves were chained at the ankles to keep them from running away. Think about that. You're expected to haul sacks of wheat, tied to 5 other people who also hate their lives. One guy stumbles, everyone eats dirt. You want teamwork? That's the wrong empire. And then there were the mine slaves. These were the truly unlucky. If field work was purgatory, the Roman mines were straight up hell. Sent underground for silver, copper, salt, or gold, these poor souls inhaled toxic dust, crawled through claustrophobic tunnels, and often never saw daylight again. Life expectancy? About 2 to 5 years, if the ceiling didn't collapse or you didn't drown in toxic runoff first. The Romans didn't send free men into the mines. That would be barbaric. No, only slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war got that honor. One philosopher even called it a death sentence without a trial. He was right. Minors weren't even counted in slave registers because they didn't last long enough to justify the paperwork. Now let's climb up the very slippery and still awful social ladder to household slaves, those lucky few who lived under the same roof as their masters. Sounds better, right? Nope, just different flavor of despair. Household slaves, or familia urbana, were everywhere. They were cooks, doormen, nurses, nannies, tutors, seamstresses, barbers, secretaries, and probably emotional punching bags. They were the invisible engine of Roman domestic life. Your day began before your master's. That meant before sunrise, because the master didn't like waking up without his sandals warmed and his wine diluted to perfection. You'd tidy the villa, stoke the fires, prepare the food, and act as personal assistant, therapist, and GPS for someone who saw you as slightly more valuable than a broom. If you were a cook, your day was one long exercise in avoiding poison accusations. If your master got a stomachache, guess whose neck is on the chopping block? Literally. Roman cuisine involved delicacies like fermented fish sauce, garum, flamingo tongues, and wine mixed with lead. So your job was to turn food crimes into gourmet meals, while not dying from fumes or flames. Wet nurses had it worse. Imagine being forced to breastfeed your owner's baby while your own child, born in slavery, was sold off to another household. And then imagine smiling through it, because sadness wasn't permitted, unless the master needed a good cry and asked you to weep softly in the corner. Pedagogues, tutor slaves, were often Greek intellectuals captured during wars. One day you're teaching philosophy in Athens, the next you're explaining the alphabet to a Roman toddler who screams and throws figs at you. You had to be brilliant, but also silent, obedient, and invisible, because no one likes a slave who's smarter than the master. You might be thinking, but didn't some household slaves have nice clothes and status? Sure, and a bear at the circus gets a costume too. That doesn't mean he's not chained to a pole and beaten for tricks. Some slaves were highly trusted. They managed finances, wrote letters, even advised senators. But they were still slaves. The owner could sell them, beat them, or kill them on a whim. A loyal accountant one day, a corpse in the Tiber the next. That's job insecurity Roman style. The worst part? You had to act like it was an honor. Gratitude was expected if your master gave you a new tunic or didn't hit you that week. You were supposed to thank him, loudly, in front of others. Bonus points if you cried. And don't forget, you had to spy too. Masters often forced slaves to report on each other, who was lazy, who was stealing, who dared to whisper that Rome wasn't all that great. Loyalty wasn't earned, it was demanded with the looming promise of torture. At night, if you weren't still working, you collapsed on a mat near the kitchen or in a hallway or wherever you wouldn't be stepped on. Privacy didn't exist, peace was a myth, and the morning would start all over again. This was Roman slavery. A machine designed to wring every drop of labor, dignity, and hope from its victims, and keep them alive just long enough to do it again tomorrow. If you thought being chained to a vineyard and whipped for walking too slowly was the worst fate for a Roman slave, congratulations, you're not ready for the entertainment industry, because nothing says civilization quite like forcing people to kill each other for sport, while nobles bet on who dies fastest. Let's talk about gladiators. The ancient Roman equivalent of reality TV meets UFC meets involuntary blood sacrifice. Not all gladiators were slaves, but a lot were. Prisoners of war, criminals, and those unlucky enough to be born into slavery, with a good jawline and a strong torso. These poor souls were selected, trained, and thrown into arenas to fight for public amusement. Training began at the ludus, or gladiator school, which was basically a prison with a gym. You got food, sure, you got medical care. Why? Because you were an investment. No one wanted their gladiator dying of dysentery before the opening round. But don't mistake this for kindness. Training was brutal. You fought with wooden swords until you either got good or got unconscious. If you disobeyed, you were beaten, starved, or worse, branded like livestock. Because, well, you were livestock, just louder and with more blood. Once you were arena ready, your life became a mix of fame, fear, and frequent dismemberment. Crowds loved it. Nobles bet fortunes on you. Women carved your name into walls. You were a slave celebrity, adored and doomed. If you fought well and survived long enough, you might be granted freedom. Might. Many didn't. They died to thunderous applause, their corpses dragged away like used props. But hey, at least they weren't mining salt, right? Now let's move from the arena to the bedroom, where things didn't get more pleasant, just more disturbing. Sex slavery in Rome wasn't hidden. It was institutional, open, normalized. Brothels were full of slaves. So were elite homes. Some were born into it. Others were purchased specifically for it. None had a choice. Owners decided what you wore, who touched you, and when. If a rich Roman man wanted to parade his young slave boy at a dinner party, that was considered sophisticated. Female slaves were expected to entertain guests, which was a polite way of saying, be assaulted without complaining. Sex slaves had no legal protections. Rape didn't exist as a concept for slaves. It was just called discipline or use. The law viewed it as a property issue. If someone else touched your slave without permission, you weren't angry because they hurt a person. You were angry because they used your stuff. And before you ask, yes, this applied to children too. Rome had no age of consent for slaves. It was cruelty dressed in togas and legal language. Some sex slaves ended up in brothels where life was measured in coins and bruises. The state taxed prostitution. It even licensed it. And the prostitutes had no rights, no autonomy, and no hope. Most died young. Some were buried with broken bones. Others weren't buried at all. Even in the best case scenario, a favored concubine might gain influence over her master, but she was still property. If he grew bored or got married, she could be sold, discarded, or killed. Love stories? Sure, tragic ones, lots of sobbing and stabbing. Now, let's take a hard left into something somehow worse. The Roman kitchen. You might not think of chefs as victims of torture, but Roman slave cooks had one of the most stressful jobs in the empire. Imagine being forced to serve an emperor who might kill you for oversalting the flamingo tongue. Cooks were expected to know thousands of recipes, most of which involved ingredients that didn't go together and shouldn't exist. Picture making a sauce of fermented fish guts, honey, and crushed pine nuts, and having to convince your master that yes, this is delicious. If the food wasn't up to par, you might be whipped, slapped, or publicly humiliated. Roman banquet culture was theater, and you were the backstage crew. You had to prepare peacocks with their feathers still on, boil ostrich eggs, stuff dormice with nuts, and then disappear so the guests wouldn't see who actually made it all happen. Some cooks became famous, but remember, famous slave is just a fancy way of saying popular until someone gets mad. Let's not forget about public slaves either. These were slaves who technically belonged to the state. They worked in temples, kept public baths clean, and did maintenance on roads and aqueducts. Their lives were slightly more stable, slightly, but still stripped of freedom. A temple slave might tend fires, clean statues, or carry offerings. But one wrong move and you could be reassigned, or re-sacrificed. After all, some religious ceremonies still included actual human sacrifice in the early republic. So, yay for sacred service? Meanwhile, bathhouse slaves cleaned up after the world's worst customers. Romans bathed in public, daily. Hundreds of sweaty, oiled-up citizens came through, leaving behind body grease, hair, blood, and whatever diseases they'd picked up at last night's orgy. Guess whose job it was to mop that up? With no soap, no gloves, and no gratitude. One slip-up, and you might end up in the bath, dead because someone thought you were taking too long to clean vomit off the mosaic tiles. Glamorous, right? Then there were slaves who worked in Roman factories, also known as ergastula, basically prison workshops. These were underground sweatshops with no windows, no fresh air, and no humanity. You worked making pottery, weapons, cloth, anything mass-produced for Rome's endless appetite. You didn't learn a craft. You learned how to repeat the same motion 1,000 times a day until your body broke. If you collapsed, someone else took your place and stepped over you. Rome was proud of its economy. Senators boasted about how efficient their villas were, but no one mentioned the legions of broken backs, cracked fingers, and shattered lives that made it possible. Because in Rome, slavery wasn't just a labor system. It was the invisible scaffolding holding the entire society upright, and everyone knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. So you've been whipped, worked to the bone, starved, and humiliated for years on end. You have no money, no name, no future, but you do have access to knives and some very angry friends. Welcome to slave rebellion in ancient Rome, where freedom was rare, but vengeance was occasionally on the menu. Let's talk about the name that made every Roman senator check behind the curtain at bathhouses, Spartacus. Now, if you've seen the movies, you know him as a muscle-bound gladiator who yells his name dramatically. But here's the historical truth. Spartacus wasn't just a symbol. He was a walking disaster for Rome. A former soldier turned enslaved gladiator, he used his training, brains, and sheer rage to organize one of the most terrifying uprisings in Roman history. It all started around 73 BCE at the gladiator school in Capua, basically the Hell's Kitchen of southern Italy. Spartacus and around 70 fellow slaves said, "You know what? We're done being pincushions for Roman entertainment." They broke out, armed themselves with kitchen utensils, yes, kitchen utensils, and stormed the countryside. What started as a jailbreak turned into a full-blown slave war. Spartacus quickly gained thousands of followers, runaway slaves, angry peasants, and anyone else who hated Rome, which was a large demographic. This wasn't a ragtag mob anymore. It was a mobile, coordinated, extremely pissed-off army, burning estates, defeating Roman legions, and reminding the Republic that maybe building an empire on human misery wasn't such a long-term strategy after all. They didn't just survive, they won battles repeatedly. Roman forces underestimated them, laughed at them, and then bled on the ground when the slaves didn't run. For 2 years, Spartacus outmaneuvered generals and embarrassed elites. He marched up and down Italy like he was redecorating the place. His army grew into the tens of thousands, and every freed slave meant fewer hands picking olives for Rome's brunch tables. But eventually, the empire stopped laughing. Rome sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most ruthless men alive, to crush the rebellion, and he brought the full force of Roman cruelty with him. Crassus built walls to trap Spartacus's army in the south. He cornered them, and when it was finally over, after the final bloody battle, Rome took revenge like only Rome could. 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way. That's right, 6,000 crosses lining the road like the world's worst Christmas decorations, left to rot as a warning. Don't you ever dream of freedom again. But even in failure, Spartacus became legend, a man who refused to die on his knees, who dared to say no in a world built on yes, master. Rome won the war, sure, but they never forgot the fear. And Spartacus wasn't the only one. There were 3 major slave revolts, the Servile Wars, and countless smaller rebellions we barely hear about because the Romans erased them from history books with a shrug and a sword. Slaves didn't always rebel openly. Sometimes resistance was quiet sabotage. Let's say you're a house slave. You can't exactly start a revolution in the pantry, but you can burn the roast just enough to annoy your master. You can accidentally misplace his sandals before a Senate meeting, or fail to mention that his rival sent him poisoned wine. These little acts of rebellion were everywhere. Passive resistance, eye rolls when no one was looking, whispers in the laundry room, stealing food, feigning illness, hiding tools, pretending not to understand Latin. Every act chipped away at the illusion of total control. There were even curses, literal curse tablets. Some slaves scratched desperate prayers into lead sheets, begging the gods for revenge. Blind my master, strike down the one who beat me. May she fall in the latrine and never rise. Yes, that's a real one. It wasn't just vengeance, it was hope, scratched in secret, buried in the earth, sent to the gods like spiritual daggers. Sometimes resistance meant escape. Runaway slaves were a huge problem in Rome. There were bounty hunters, laws, dog-sniffing squads, but still they ran, into forests, into cities, across borders. Roman writers complained constantly about slave escapes because everyone wanted out, and who could blame them? But here's the kicker. Slaves weren't just property, they were terrified of being treated as such. If you got caught trying to escape, best case, whipping. Worst case, crucifixion, and not the quick kind. The Romans made an art out of slow, public message-sending death. You didn't just die, you became a billboard. The empire needed its slaves to obey, not because they believed it was just, but because they feared the alternative. Which brings us to a question Romans rarely asked out loud. What if the slaves stopped cooperating? What if every cook burned the stew, Every miner smashed his pick. Every household slave vanished in the night. Rome didn't just rely on its military. It relied on a massive psychological campaign. Break their will, kill their leaders, erase their stories, and hope no one ever dares to rise again. But the cracks were always there. Let's say you survived. You weren't trampled in the arena. You didn't collapse in the fields. You weren't sold to a brothel or caught plotting rebellion in the laundry room. You've done your time, involuntarily, and you're still breathing. Now comes the burning question. Can a slave in Rome actually become free? The answer is yes, but don't celebrate yet. Roman freedom came with asterisk after asterisk, fine print in Latin, and more loopholes than a Roman aqueduct. The process was called manumission, and it came in a few different flavors, most of them suspiciously self-serving. The most dramatic form was the formal manumission ceremony, often performed in front of a magistrate. Your master would announce, "This person is now free," tap you with a rod, and just like that, poof, you were a freedman or freedwoman. Cue the applause, right? Well, hold the ovation, because while you were technically no longer a slave, Rome didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. You didn't become a citizen, not right away. You became a second-class human, better than a cow, worse than a senator. Your legal status was free, but your obligations weren't. Freed slaves were expected to remain loyal to their former owners, now called their patronus. You owed them favors. You owed them labor. You might still live in their house. And if they needed you to fetch grapes or babysit their shrieking toddler, you did it. Not because they could whip you anymore, because the entire system was built on guilt, gratitude, and legal blackmail. Oh, and if you got too cocky or disrespectful, your former master could drag you into court and have your freedom revoked. That's right, freedom could be repossessed, like a defective chariot. But let's rewind a little, because most slaves didn't get the formal ceremony. They got informal manumission, usually by being told, "You can go now," after 20 years of service and 3 near-death experiences. This kind of freedom was shaky. Informal manumission didn't always hold up in court. If your master died and didn't write it down, his heirs could just say, "Never heard of him," and put you right back in chains. Your entire liberty could depend on a napkin scribble or whether the new owner was feeling generous. Still, some slaves did manage to climb the ladder, especially if they were highly skilled. Scribes, accountants, physicians, teachers. If you were literate and knew math, you were basically a unicorn. Valuable, trusted, and watched very closely. These elite slaves could save up money, peculium, their small, allowed stash of earnings. If they were smart and lucky, they could eventually buy their own freedom. Imagine that, spending 30 years washing someone else's feet, just to pay them for the privilege of no longer doing so. Congratulations, you're free. And now you get to enter the glorious shining new world of Roman prejudice. Freedmen were often mocked, especially if they got rich. If a former slave became successful, a rare but possible outcome, Romans side-eyed them like they'd cheated the system. Senators sneered. Poets wrote slanderous verses. You were never really one of them. You were a social climber with slave stank in your background. And don't even think about public office. Even if you were rich, literate, and more competent than every toga-clad aristocrat in the Senate, the law said no. Slaves and their children were barred from holding top positions for generations. Because Rome loved rules, especially rules that kept you in your place. Some freedmen leaned into the hustle. They became entrepreneurs, running taverns, bathhouses, or import businesses. Others became clients, hanging around their old master's house, wearing nice clothes, trying to blend in with the freeborn citizens, and mostly being treated like slightly fancy pets. If your old master liked you, they might leave you something in their will: land, money, or continued protection. If they didn't like you, well, good luck. You were on your own in a society built to remind you where you came from. For female slaves, freedom was even messier. A woman might be manumitted after years of service, or childbirth. Some masters freed women they had children with, either out of guilt, affection, or social pressure. Others waited until their concubines aged out of favor and handed them a goodbye scroll and a sarcastic "good luck." Freed women faced constant suspicion. Were they ex-prostitutes? Were they trying to seduce their way into respectability? The stigma was heavy, and the opportunities light. Some did well, especially if they managed property or married up. But most were trapped in the same cycle of survival, just without chains. And let's not forget, freedom was not inherited. If you were a freed slave and had children, they were freeborn, but your past still followed you like a bad haircut. Your grandchildren might finally be considered normal Romans, but even that wasn't guaranteed. So after all that suffering, all that scraping and obeying and hoping, freedom came not as a glorious sunrise, but as a gray, overcast afternoon with legal rain clouds. It's fitting in a way. Rome, the empire that conquered half the known world, couldn't quite figure out how to deal with the people it used to build it. Slaves were everywhere and in everything, digging the aqueducts, birthing the emperor's bastards, bleeding in the amphitheaters, wiping marble floors with their bare hands. And then, if they were lucky, they got to leave the system with scars and a shaky status that said, "Congratulations, you're a human now, sort of." This was the daily life of Roman slaves, not a footnote, not background characters in a toga drama. They were the engine behind the empire, and the empire, in return, gave them blood, chains, ashes, and occasionally, the kind of freedom that didn't quite taste like victory. Thanks for sticking with me through this marathon descent into Roman madness. Now, if this was your kind of historical nightmare, and I truly hope it was, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and let me know what bizarre topic you want me to explore next. Until then, sleep tight, and remember, if anyone asks you to help around the villa and hands you a collar, run.
Tonight we're setting sail, right into the sheer madness of wooden ships, unwashed sailors, and maps scribbled by drunk cartographers. The age of exploration is romanticized as a time of bold discovery, but for the men on deck, it was more like a floating prison with extra vomiting. Let's say you're a European peasant in the 15th century. Life is already bad. You're poor, you stink, and your teeth are just decorative gravel. But then one day, a recruiter walks into your muddy village and promises gold, adventure, and glory on the high seas. You say yes. Congratulations. You've just signed up for one of the worst jobs in human history. You are now a sailor in the age of exploration, a time when people believed sea monsters were real, navigation was astrology with attitude, and nobody could swim. That's right. Most sailors couldn't swim. If you fell overboard, your choices were drown or pray Poseidon was in a good mood. Let's start with the ship, your new home, coffin, and torture chamber. These vessels weren't cruise liners. They were floating barrels nailed together with rotten rope and superstition. Ships like the Santa Maria or the Victoria were about 80 feet long and crammed with 20 to 60 men, plus rats, weevils, and the general stench of fear. Privacy? Nope. Comfort? Hilarious. You slept on the deck or wherever you could find a dry spot, which was never. Everything was damp. Your bed was your coat, your pillow was a coil of rope, and your lullaby was the sound of waves smashing against the hull and your crewmate vomiting next to your head. The day started early. Very early. Did the sun even agree to this? Early. You were yanked awake by the bosun's whistle or just kicked by someone with seniority. Then came chores, because surprise, you're not here to sightsee. You're here to work yourself to death. Tasks included scrubbing the deck with sand and urine, yes, urine, because it's sterilized, hauling ropes that weighed more than you, patching torn sails in a howling storm, and climbing rigging so high your soul left your body halfway up. The food? Oh, the food. Every sailor's favorite part. Here's today's menu, hardtack, which is basically a medieval cracker forged from flour, water, and hatred. It's so hard you have to soak it in something to eat it, usually beer, or brine, or your own tears. Also salt pork. Not bacon. Not ham. Salt pork, a block of pig fat aged like revenge. Smells like regret, tastes like it too. On special days, you might get dried peas. And if the cook didn't burn them to ash or drop them overboard, that was considered a win. Drinks? Mostly ale or stale water with bugs doing laps in it. Clean water didn't exist after the first few days. Rain was caught in buckets and stored in barrels, which quickly became swamp stew. And let's talk about scurvy, the sailor's eternal enemy. It's what happens when your body realizes you haven't seen a fruit or vegetable since you left shore. Your gums swell. Your teeth fall out. Your skin bruises if someone looks at you too hard. Eventually, you bleed out from your eyeballs. Fun! Nobody knew what caused it, so you were just expected to power through. Feeling faint? Can't stand up? Too bad. Grab a rope, sunshine, or get whipped. Speaking of which, punishment at sea was its own circle of hell. Discipline was brutal and public. The classic was flogging, tied to the masts and lashed with a cat-o'-nine tails until your back resembled overcooked meat. Offenses included sleeping on duty, stealing rations, mouthing off, or just existing in a way that irritated the officer of the day. For bigger crimes, like mutiny, cowardice, or accidentally setting something on fire, you might be keelhauled. That's where they tied a rope around your waist and dragged you under the ship's barnacle-crusted hull until you were either flayed alive or drowned. There were no HR departments. But the worst punishment of all? Being marooned. That meant you were dropped off on a tiny, uninhabited island with no food, no water, and no hope. Basically, the 16th century version of, "We're done with you." And still, thousands signed up. Why? Because life on land was somehow even worse. The age of exploration was also the age of plague, war, famine, and zero job opportunities unless you liked dying in a field. The sea offered something else, possibility. A chance to escape your lot, maybe strike it rich, or at least die somewhere exotic. Of course, most sailors didn't find treasure. What they found were storms. Imagine being on a tiny wooden ship in the middle of the Atlantic when the sky turns black and the wind screams like a banshee with a grudge. Sails rip. Waves slam over the deck. Barrels break loose and crush your leg. You can't hear commands, and if you mess up the rigging, the mast falls, and everyone dies. There's lightning. There's fire. There's panic. You're wet, cold, blind, and convinced that Neptune has finally come to collect. If you survive, you spend the next 3 days pumping water out of the hold, repairing damage with whatever scraps you can find, and praying your compass didn't get thrown overboard with the stew pot. And then, just when you think it can't get worse, someone spots land. But this isn't a Disney ending. You're not welcomed by locals with flowers. You're either greeted with confusion, arrows, or malaria. Sometimes all three. So, you've survived the open sea. You didn't drown, fall from the rigging, get flogged into oblivion, or die of scurvy-induced gum explosions. Your ship limps into some exotic coastline, and someone shouts, "Land ho!" You think, "Finally, salvation!" Wrong. Because now begins an entirely new kind of torment. Landfall. The age of exploration's version of out of the frying pan, into the dysentery. Let's start with disembarking. It wasn't graceful. There were no docks or gangways. You either rowed in longboats through shark-infested shallows or jumped waist-deep into the surf while clutching your boots and hoping the local wildlife didn't bite. Spoiler, it did. If you were lucky, the island or coast was uninhabited. That meant you had to build shelter, find clean water, good luck, and not die from sunstroke, dehydration, or being eaten alive by mosquitoes the size of grapes. If it was inhabited, things got dicey fast. You didn't speak the language. They didn't know who you were. You looked, sounded, and smelled like trouble. So unless your captain had the diplomacy of a saint, things often went from awkward silence to spears in the face real quick. A lot of first contact went like this: wave, smile, shoot. Congratulations. You're now an ambassador of colonial awkwardness, backed by gunpowder, typhoid, and ignorance. Let's talk disease. You brought it with you. Your ship was a floating petri dish of smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and mystery pox number 7. And you didn't just spread it to locals, you spread it to yourself. The minute you drank bad water or touched a tropical bug with too many legs, it was game over. One unlucky sip and suddenly you're sweating, shivering, and evacuating everything from every possible orifice. The ship's surgeon might offer treatment, which usually meant sawing something off, or prescribing mercury, or just shrugging and preparing the burial cloth. And what about the captain's plan now that you're on land? That's cute. You thought there was a plan. Most expeditions had instructions like, find spices, or claim territory, which was like sending someone into the forest with a spoon and saying, build a mansion. Supplies ran out fast. Maps were wrong. Some sailors just wandered off into the jungle and were never seen again, either eaten, adopted, or turned into cautionary myths. Others were put to work building makeshift forts, which meant chopping trees for 14 hours straight, while covered in bug bites and slowly losing your mind. You were still under military discipline, still flogged for slacking off, and now working in heat so brutal your brain felt like porridge in a helmet. You thought land meant rest? Land meant new jobs, new diseases, and new ways to die. And let's not forget the weather. Monsoons, hurricanes, flash floods. You had zero warning, no shelter, and no clue what was coming. One minute you're digging a latrine, next minute you're being swept into a crocodile-infested river because someone forgot to check the sky. Every attempt to explore inland meant hauling cargo through swamps, hacking vines, falling into sinkholes, or waking up to a snake in your boot. If you woke up, some sailors were assigned to stay at the beach camp and guard supplies. This sounds easy. It wasn't. You were in charge of making sure nobody stole the barrels of moldy flour and soggy gunpowder, while also defending against wildlife, weather, and your own crewmates trying to sneak an early death by rum. Because yes, you were still starving. The rations didn't get better on land. Tropical fruits? Too rare. Local game? Too fast. Your diet remained a sad remix of salted meat, wormy biscuits, and water that tasted like a foot. Your body started to break down in strange ways, muscle cramps, blurry vision, sudden hatred of everything. And then there was paranoia. Sailors had no idea where they were. Captains made decisions based on hearsay, rumors, and occasionally a bird's flight pattern. If things went wrong, and they always did, people started pointing fingers. Maybe the navigator was lying. Maybe the local guide was misleading you. Maybe there was gold, and someone hid it. Suddenly, men who'd shared a ship for months turned into backstabbing lunatics fueled by heat stroke and superstition. Mutinies didn't just happen at sea. They happened in jungles, on beaches, in hastily built forts, and in the middle of nowhere with nobody watching except the local monkey population. And still, through all of this, the mission had to continue. Plant the flag. Claim the land. Send some poor half-dead sailor back to the ship with a letter scrawled in blood and seawater. Found new territory. Also diarrhea. Please send help. Some men made it back to the ship. Some didn't. Some ships left without them. If you were lucky enough to return to the vessel, wounded and exhausted, you were rewarded with the same moldy hammock, same weevil crackers, and the delightful news that you'd be setting sail again, tomorrow. Because this wasn't a vacation. This was an endless, grinding loop of hell, only occasionally interrupted by bad singing and worse hygiene. And yet people kept signing up. Why? Because word got around. A few lucky voyages struck gold, literally. Some captains returned rich. Some crewmen found gems, spices, or exotic animals. Those stories spread faster than fleas, and soon every boy in Europe dreamed of adventure. They didn't hear about the part where you buried half your friends, ate leather straps to survive, or watched your ship rot in a mosquito swamp. Nope. They heard. Glory. So they signed up. By now, you've survived the sea, landfall, dysentery, storms, snakes, and a captain with all the leadership skills of a drunk raccoon. You've buried a third of the crew, eaten something that may or may not have once been a shoe, and learned that coconut water isn't as glamorous when it's the only thing standing between you and organ failure. But wait, what's that glinting in the riverbed? Could it be? Yes. It's gold. Or maybe shiny rocks. Hard to say when your vision's going blurry and your teeth are starting to migrate south. This is the age of exploration, where greed powers the sails more than wind ever could. Your ship wasn't just launched to explore new lands, it was sent to steal whatever wasn't nailed down. Gold, silver, spices, exotic animals, plants, people. If it looked valuable and didn't immediately stab you, it was going in the cargo hold. Let's talk about treasure fever, which is exactly what it sounds like. The moment one guy finds a gold nugget, and suddenly every single man on the expedition becomes a foaming lunatic with a pickaxe. Rational thinking? Gone. Hierarchy? Collapsed. Your captain is now a pirate. The cook is wearing a crown made of leaves. You've stabbed 3 people over a rumor. The worst part? Most of it wasn't even real. Maps lied. Locals lied. Captains definitely lied. Sailors were promised cities of gold, rivers of diamonds, spice islands just beyond the horizon. What they got was a swamp, a severe rash, and a mysterious bite that keeps changing colors. The legendary El Dorado? A fantasy that drove men insane. They wandered into jungles with nothing but hope and a musket, and were never seen again, unless you count the time someone found their bones politely arranged in a tree. And when treasure was found, real treasure, it didn't make things better. It made them worse. Suddenly, your ship's hold has 200 pounds of silver and exactly 0 trust. Everyone starts eyeing each other like they're calculating your market value. Friends become threats. Fights break out. Somebody, accidentally, falls off the boat. The first mate is missing an eye and insists it was always like that. The captain has locked himself in his cabin with all the loot and a loaded pistol. Congratulations, you're now sailing on the SS Paranoia. And let's not forget what that treasure costs. Colonization wasn't a polite exchange of gifts and greetings. It was conquest. Armed men showing up on foreign shores and saying, "Nice village, shame if it got torched." Sailors were often on the front line of this horror. You might be ordered to raid settlements, enslave locals, burn crops, or just stand around awkwardly while your commanding officer committed war crimes in real time. You weren't a hero. You were an accomplice with a sunburn. But here's the catch. Even if you struck it rich, even if your ship was loaded with gold, you still probably wouldn't see a coin of it. Sailors were usually paid garbage wages, and only if they survived the whole journey. The loot went to the crown, the nobles, the sponsors, the guy who owned the ship, the guy who owned that guy, and so on. By the time it trickled down to you, it was basically 2 coins and a "thank you for your service" mug carved out of driftwood. If you did get a larger share, it came with strings. You now had a target on your back. Sailors have been known to mysteriously vanish between port and payday, or spend it all on the first brothel they saw and wake up missing an ear and half their clothes. And speaking of ports, after months or years of hell at sea, you finally dock in some half-rotten colonial outpost. Time to relax? Think again. Port towns were cesspools. Literally. They reeked of fish, sweat, sewage, and broken dreams. Every building leaned slightly. Every street was mud. Every bar had a 70% chance of erupting into a knife fight over a spilled drink or someone's sister. Your captain might take your passport, if you had one, your share, which you were never actually promised in writing, and your dignity, already long gone. Then you'd be told to unload crates in the sun for 3 days, while the officers drank wine and patted each other on the back for discovering a place that had been populated for 10,000 years. Some men took the opportunity to run. Desertion was common. You'd vanish into the town, change your name, pretend to be a barrel maker, and pray no one from the ship found you. Because if they did, you were flogged, branded, or just quietly stabbed behind the saloon. But most men stayed. Why? Because after everything, you had no home to go back to. You'd been gone years. Your family assumed you were dead. And you probably were, on the inside. Plus, a lot of sailors believed, foolishly, that this time the next voyage would be different. The next captain wouldn't be insane. The next expedition would be smooth. The next port would have real bread and women with all their teeth. So they signed up again. Even though their lungs were filled with salt, their backs were twisted, and their minds were unspooling like damp rope. Because to a sailor in the age of exploration, the unknown still felt less terrible than going home empty-handed. You've done it. You survived the voyage from hell. You crossed uncharted oceans, dodged storms, pirates, mutinies, and a suspiciously ambitious ship's cook. You found land, probably caught 3 new diseases, possibly witnessed some light colonialism, and then sailed back through seas so rough your soul almost got tossed overboard. And now, land is in sight again. A homecoming. Sweet, blessed civilization. Except, it's not sweet. It's barely civilized. And it doesn't want you back. Let's begin with arriving home. You expect cheering crowds and maybe a medal. What you actually get is quarantine. That's right. After floating in your own filth for months, the port authorities take one look at your mold-covered ship and say, "Absolutely not. You're stuck offshore for a few more weeks, just in case you're carrying smallpox, the plague, or the Black Death's weird younger cousin. If someone dies during quarantine, you bury them at sea. If someone goes mad, you tie them up. If someone starts preaching about mermaids and the end of the world, you kind of just let it happen. At this point, it's entertainment. Finally, you're led ashore. And what greets you? Paperwork. You have to report to naval officers, trade officials, or some guy with a powdered wig and a god complex who demands a full inventory of the loot, half of which was stolen, lost, eaten, or turned into hats during a 3-day rum hallucination. You might not even get paid. Why? Because the ship took on damage, and repairs are expensive. Or because your contract had small print. Or because the captain says you were insubordinate, even though all you did was scream, "We're all gonna die," a few times a day like everyone else. Assuming you do get paid, it's likely months late and hilariously underwhelming. Maybe 5 silver coins, a moldy biscuit, and a handshake from a man who smells like garlic and regret. And then, you're released into the world. But you're not the same. Your body is wrecked. You've lost teeth. Your skin is cracked, sun-leathered, and crawling with lice. Your muscles ache constantly, your lungs sound like a rusty accordion, and your hair is falling out in tufts. You're 24 and look 62. Your mind isn't much better. You flinch at seagulls. You hear creaking even when the ground doesn't move. You wake up screaming about cannibals and misread clouds. Your dreams smell like tar and burning fish. Welcome to the age of exploration version of PTSD, post-tropical stress disorder. You try to go home. Maybe to your family, if they're still alive and remember you. But you're no longer the person who left. You eat with your hands. You mutter about ghost ships. You look longingly at barrels and start carving your initials into chairs. Or maybe you don't have a home anymore. In that case, you join the local underclass, a sailor without a ship. You haunt taverns, pick fights, gamble away your last coin, and smell so bad that even the fleas keep their distance. You tell grand stories no one believes. You claim you saw Atlantis, punched a shark, ate a phoenix. Everyone laughs. You laugh too. Then you drink until the memories go fuzzy again. There's no pension, no sailors' union, no therapy, no medical care. If you get sick, you either recover on your own or don't. Surgeons still believe in leeches and holes drilled into skulls to let out the madness. If you break a leg, you hobble forever. If you go blind, you become a beggar. If you go insane, You might be lucky enough to become a street prophet. Some try to sign up again. Not because they want to, but because there's nothing else. You know how to climb rigging, not plant potatoes. You can gut a fish with your eyes closed, but you don't remember how to make polite conversation. Society doesn't want you, but the sea? The sea always wants you back. And here's the kicker. History won't remember your name. Your captain might become a legend. The expedition might go down in books, painted on murals, sung about in ballads. But you'll be a footnote. Crew 78 men, 42 lost at sea, 11 executed, 3 eaten, 1 went mad and thought he was a lighthouse. Even the logs might misspell your name, or forget it entirely. You were the hands that raised the sails, the back that hauled the cannon, the lungs that shouted warnings, the arms that rowed ashore, the body that fell ill and kept marching anyway. You endured every horror the sea could throw at you, and in the end, all you got was some coin, some scars, and stories no one believed. But you know the truth. You know what it felt like to stare into a storm so black it swallowed the sky. You know the taste of salt, sweat, and desperation. You've seen islands no map dared show, and lived long enough to call them nightmares. You've been to the edge of the world and found that the monsters weren't out there. They were you, when the hunger came, when the madness set in, when the ocean whispered promises in your sleep. So why did you sail? Maybe for money. Maybe for glory. Maybe because you were poor, desperate, or just stupid. But mostly, because you didn't know any better. And now, having heard it all, either do we. Thanks for joining this deep dive into nautical nightmare fuel. The age of exploration, great for empires, absolutely horrific for anyone with a job title below Admiral. Before you reach for that disinfectant spray or press the start button on your robot vacuum, take a moment to imagine a world where neither existed. Imagine a house full of dust, fleas, soot, and mysterious odors, and now imagine trying to clean it using nothing but twigs, ashes, and pure desperation. Let's be clear, cleanliness, historically, was not next to godliness. It was more like next to impossible. For most of human history, cleaning your house wasn't about Marie Kondo-ing your soul or impressing guests with minimalist chic. It was survival, a daily battle against filth, rot, insects, and smells strong enough to make your ancestors weep from beyond the grave. Let's start in a mud hut. Not metaphorically. A literal mud hut. Because that's where a significant chunk of humanity lived for centuries. Your floor is compacted dirt. Your walls are daubed with a tasteful mixture of clay, dung, and straw. Your ceiling is thatched and home to at least 3 colonies of spiders you named for entertainment. Now, how do you clean that? The short answer, you don't. You maintain it. Every few days, someone, usually you, would sweep the dirt floor using a bundle of stiff grass or twigs tied together with string, hair, or more twigs. This sweeping didn't remove the dirt. It just redistributed it. You'd push it into the corners, out the door, or underneath sleeping mats, which acted as medieval vacuum cleaner bags. If your floor got especially gross, like blood from a butchering pig gross, you had 2 options. 1. Throw some fresh straw on it, and pretend it never happened. 2. Slap on a new layer of mud plaster. Cleaning by burying. It worked surprisingly well and also explains why some ancient homes gained several inches in elevation over the years. And then there were animal roommates. Dogs, cats, chickens, goats, the occasional drunk pig. They all wandered in and out of your home. House boundaries were a suggestion. With them came poop, fur, fleas, and feathers, which you were expected to casually sweep aside while praying the rats didn't get bold again. Smells? They were everywhere. Your cooking fire, your drying fish, your uncle's socks, the neighbor's cheese, all competing in a feral olfactory battle royale. To freshen the air, you might burn herbs, spread fragrant rushes or hay on the floor, or hang bundles of dried flowers, spices, or onion skins. One popular method? Boiling vinegar. Yes, really. Nothing screams ambience like hot acidic fumes wafting through your thatch. Now, let's talk about walls. You might assume they stayed clean because they weren't walked on. Ha! Foolish 21st century logic. Walls were frequently coated with smoke from indoor fires, sticky from oil splatters, and occasionally decorated with insect eggs, mold, or just mysterious stains no one questioned. If you were wealthy, i.e., someone who didn't smell like turnip stew 24/7, you had plastered or whitewashed walls. These, too, got filthy. Cleaning them meant scraping off the top layer with a knife, slathering on new lime, or just repainting over the grime with the OL medieval version of move fast and paint over the problem. Then there's the ceiling. Or more accurately, the thatch, home to a miniature wildlife reserve. Mice, beetles, nesting birds, and spiders would drop things on your head with appalling frequency. Cleaning a thatched roof wasn't a weekly chore. It was an event. You got on a ladder, waved a broom around blindly, shrieked when something moved, and then decided it was probably fine for another year or 5. The hearth was the centerpiece of the home, and also the dirtiest. It burned almost constantly. Soot coated everything. Ash got into your food, your clothes, your bed. But it was warm, so no one complained. Cleaning the hearth meant shoveling out ash, brushing it down with a branch, and occasionally scrubbing soot off pots with more ash. Yes. Cleaning fire residue with different fire residue. It's the kind of logic that only works in a house made of mud and resignation. What about furniture? Most early homes didn't really have it. If they did, it was heavy, made of unpolished wood, and carved from a tree that someone probably fought a bear for. Cleaning tables or benches meant wiping them with a damp rag, if rags were available, or a hand, or the cat. Scrubbing didn't exist. If something got sticky or bloody, you'd sand it down, or flip it over, or just call it patina. And then we come to the bedding situation, which can only be described as tragic. Your bed was likely a pile of straw, furs, or woven reeds. It smelled like wet grass and old shoes. It had fleas. It had lice. It possibly had mice. Cleaning it meant picking it apart, fluffing it, or replacing it entirely, which you only did when it stopped being bed and started being nest of nightmares. If you were fancy, your mattress was stuffed with feathers or wool, which also got musty, damp, and full of pests. There was no dry cleaning. There was no Febreze. You hung it outside, beat it with a stick, and hoped the sun killed whatever was nesting in it. Cloth? Don't even get started. Curtains, if they existed, were basically grease traps. Tablecloths were reused until they disintegrated. Rags were just old clothes that had finally given up. And actual cleaning cloths? You made do with whatever fabric hadn't already been turned into pants or bandages. The water situation made things worse. You didn't have plumbing. You had a bucket. And a creek. If you were unlucky, you had a well full of frogs. Hauling water was exhausting, and every drop was precious. So unless something absolutely needed scrubbing, you let it fester. And don't forget, you weren't just cleaning dirt. You were cleaning disease. Well, trying to. In a world where bacteria hadn't been discovered yet, people believed that bad air caused illness. So they cleaned with herbs, incense, or literally opening the door and yelling at the sickness to leave. Sometimes they rubbed salt on things, or urine, or ash, or lye, all of which sort of worked but also caused chemical burns if you weren't careful. Because in pre-modern cleaning, effective and safe rarely overlapped. If your home smelled slightly less like death and didn't collapse in a breeze, that was considered clean. If you thought sweeping your mud floor with a stick broom was bad, congratulations, you're about to enter the urban nightmare. Ancient cities and medieval towns weren't just bustling, they were breeding grounds for filth, chaos, and the occasional outbreak of dancing plague. Cleaning your home here wasn't just difficult. It was an act of defiance against nature, neighbors, and your own lower standards. Let's begin with ancient Rome, a city famous for its aqueducts, bathhouses, and open-air public toilets, so civilized. But step into the average Roman's home, and suddenly, the grandeur stops at the doorstep. If you lived in an insula, basically a 5-story fire trap apartment for plebeians, you had no plumbing upstairs, no running water, no insulation, a very high chance of your ceiling collapsing in the rain. So, how did you clean? First, you begged the gods. Then you grabbed your slave, if you were rich. If not, you did it yourself using the holy trinity of Roman household sanitation: broom, rag, vinegar. Floors were swept, walls were wiped, and anything sticky was scraped with a knife or covered with sand until it stopped sticking. Vinegar was the MVP. It cut grease, masked smells, and acted as a disinfectant, though people didn't know that. They just liked how it made the room smell like a salad. But even a clean room could quickly become a horror show. Why? Because garbage was everywhere. People threw food scraps, bones, fish guts, and worse out the window. Into the streets. Into alleys. Into that one neighbor's courtyard they didn't like. The result: rats the size of small cats, clouds of flies, and the kind of stench that makes your soul evacuate your body. If you wanted your home to be less disgusting, you had to physically remove the filth yourself. No trash service. No sewer hookup unless you lived on the ground floor near a latrine, aka the world's most cursed blessing. You might sweep the courtyard. You might dump old wash water, gray water if you're fancy, into the alley. You might burn trash, but that would just coat your walls in soot. The air inside was thick with smoke, cooking grease, incense, and human effort. Think ode to burnt lentil soup and desperation. Now let's glide gracefully into medieval Europe, where people upgraded their cleaning routine by adding religious guilt and superstition. Cleanliness was morally suspect. If your house was too neat, people assumed you were either a witch or had something to hide. Dusty corners? Good. It meant you had better things to do, like surviving. Cleaning supplies? Non-existent. You used what you had. Water? If you had it, don't waste it. Ash? Excellent. Straw? Amazing. Animal fat? Put that on the walls. The logic was, if it makes the bugs leave, it's cleaning. Floor coverings were replaced with the medieval equivalent of Glade plugins, fresh herbs. People would strew rushes, mint, lavender, or wormwood all over the ground. It smelled pleasant for about 30 seconds, then turned into compost beneath your feet. No one swept it. You just threw more herbs on top. This continued until you were essentially walking on a fragrant mulch pit. The toilet situation didn't help. Most homes didn't have one. You used a chamber pot or went in the street. Upper floors might have a garderobe, a delightful wooden shaft that dropped your waste straight into the moat, alley, or unlucky neighbor's yard. The smell climbed back up. Cleaning it meant dumping buckets of gray water down and hoping gravity did the rest. As for walls and ceilings, smoke from the hearth caked everything in black goo. Cobwebs were decorations. If you had money, you'd whitewash occasionally with lime, which helped kill bugs. If not, you'd just wipe the worst bits off with a rag and hope no one noticed the slug trail near your bed. Medieval homes also came with wildlife. Not the fun kind. We're talking fleas, lice, rats, and birds nesting in your thatch roof. Cleaning was often pest control, laying out herbs, smoking rooms, or letting your cat handle it. If your home didn't hiss at intruders, it was considered defenseless. And then there was plague cleaning. Yes, people actually tried. They burned scented wood, sprinkled vinegar, scrubbed surfaces with salt or urine, and hung sweet-smelling flowers from the ceiling. Did it help? Maybe. Did it smell like hell's perfume shop? Absolutely. Let's not forget clothing and linens, which doubled as mobile dirt transport systems. You rarely washed them. Laundry was a monumental task involving boiling water, wood ash lye, manual scrubbing, and prayer. Most people changed outfits once a week, if they had more than one outfit. Your sheets got cleaned when they could stand up on their own and threaten the cat. In wealthy homes, servants might clean daily. Scrub floors with sand or brick dust. Polish pewter with vinegar and soot. Air out linens. Chase rats with sticks. But even in castles, the standard was less awful. Not clean. Rooms smelled like sweat, stale beer, and despair hidden under lavender satchels. By now, you might be thinking, at least they didn't have to deal with plastic waste or modern toxins. True. But they did live with lead paint, open fires, raw sewage, and rotting meat next to their beds. So let's not get too nostalgic. If you thought medieval grime was bad, the industrial age came in swinging with a bucket full of soot, a lumpful of coal smoke, and a cheerful disregard for basic human safety. In this glorious era of progress, homes became dirtier, messier, and more dangerously decorated. Welcome to the Victorian cleaning nightmare, where tidiness was next to madness, and every attempt at cleanliness could kill you slowly. Let's start with coal. Coal heated your home, powered your stove, fueled your city, and turned everything in your house a delicate shade of grimy gray-black despair. Soot settled on every surface. If you breathed, moved, or even looked at a window, coal dust attached itself to you like a needy ghost. Cleaning became a daily battle against the sky. You didn't wipe windows, you scraped them. You didn't dust furniture, you shoveled it. One Victorian housekeeper reportedly had to dust the parlor 3 times a day just to prevent guests from leaving with charcoal outlines on their pants. Walls? Covered in wallpaper. Pretty? Yes. Deadly? Also yes. Many wallpapers used vivid green dyes made with arsenic. So when the paper flaked, it poisoned the air. Clean too hard? You might inhale a cloud of micro-murder. That charming floral motif? Slowly trying to kill you. But hey, at least it matched the couch. Speaking of couches, Victorian furniture was a dust trap's fever dream. Ruffled cushions, ornate carving, draped velvet, tufts and tassels on every surface. Cleaning it required time, determination, and small tools to get into the crevices where dust, crumbs, hairpins, and the occasional mouse corpse liked to hide. It was like cleaning a Baroque museum exhibit that constantly shed dandruff. Now let's discuss the floor. Wall-to-wall carpet became fashionable. Not plush, modern carpet. These were thick, woolen, dirt-loving tapestries that collected everything and repelled cleaning. You couldn't vacuum, because vacuums didn't exist yet. Instead, you beat rugs with sticks, dragged them into the yard, or tried using tea leaves to pick up dust. That's right. Dried tea leaves. Sprinkled on the carpet to bind with dirt, and then swept away like caffeinated confetti. Of course, you had help if you were middle or upper class. The Victorian household was a hierarchy of cleaning labor. At the bottom, the maid of all work, scrubbing floors before sunrise, emptying chamber pots, and blacking the stove until her knuckles resembled the coals she was scraping. At the top, you, sipping weak tea while telling her she missed a spot under the piano leg. The kitchen was ground zero for grime. Everything ran on open flames and animal fat. Grease stuck to the walls like wallpaper paste. Cleaning the stovetop meant scraping off black crust until you could see metal again, maybe. There were no degreasers, just sand, soap made from lye and tallow, and blind optimism. Water was another adventure. In the city, you might have a tap if you were rich, but many homes still relied on pumps, wells, or, worse, cisterns that doubled as mosquito spas. Boiling water was essential for cleaning. So was carrying heavy buckets upstairs, across yards, and into rooms full of ungrateful children and coughing grandmothers. Let's not forget the bathroom, or lack thereof. Many homes still had chamber pots, emptied into outhouses, cesspits, or the street. Even when indoor toilets arrived, flushing wasn't always guaranteed. Pipes froze, cracked, or simply didn't connect to anything. Cleaning a toilet meant getting way too familiar with a brush, boiling water, and the power of denial. Laundering clothes was its own hellish subroutine. White clothes were prized. Clean white clothes? A status symbol. So how did they do it? By boiling them in lye, scrubbing them with washboards until your hands bled, and bleaching them in the sun. Some added blue dye to brighten yellowed fabrics. Others used urine. Yes, again. Urine was still a go-to for whitening and stain removal. Ironing? A torture ritual. You heated solid metal irons on the stove, then used them quickly before they scorched your shirt, or cooled down and became a useless paperweight. No temperature control, just instincts and burned fingers. And then there was spring cleaning, not a cute ritual, but a full-scale household purge. Every piece of furniture moved. Every curtain taken down. Walls scrubbed, carpets beaten, windows opened, and then quickly closed to keep out more soot. It took days. Sometimes weeks. People collapsed from exhaustion. But if you didn't do it, neighbors might gossip. And in the Victorian age, social shame was worse than death. Oh, and children? Filthy. Constantly. Sticky fingers. Muddy boots. Mysterious stains. Cleaning a Victorian child was like trying to wash a cat that had rolled in jam. They rarely bathed. Maybe once a week. More if they were sick. Less if you had multiple kids and only one bathtub the size of a salad bowl. And pets? Cats kept mice away, which was great. But they also brought in fleas, dead birds, and the occasional rat head. Dogs ran through coal piles and into your bed. Cleaning them was a luxury most didn't bother with. By the time the 20th century tiptoed in wearing lace boots and smelling faintly of bleach, humanity had reached a tipping point. No, not in hygiene, in exhaustion. After centuries of wiping walls with rags, boiling underwear in urine, and politely dying from wallpaper, people had had enough. It was time to stop surviving the filth and start fighting it. Welcome to the age of cleaning technology, questionable chemicals, and the slow birth of modern cleanliness, where everything was shinier, deadlier, and marketed as scientifically pure. Let's begin with soap, which had technically existed for millennia but was finally getting a rebrand. Ancient soap was a goopy mix of animal fat and ash, mostly used to clean laundry, not bodies. But now, thanks to industrial chemistry and aggressive advertising, soap was being packaged in bars, perfumed, stamped with logos, and sold with names like Sunlight Ivory and Cleanliness is next to godliness. People were told that soap didn't just make things look clean, it killed germs, invisible monsters responsible for everything from spoiled milk to death itself. This was revolutionary. You didn't need to see the filth to fear it. And thus began the modern neurosis. If your house doesn't smell like lemon death mist, is it even clean? Early soaps weren't gentle. They stripped grease, skin, and sometimes dignity. Still, they were better than their homemade predecessors. Suddenly, households could buy cleanliness by the bar. Floors got scrubbed with pine tar soaps. Linen soaked in suds. Children were bathed, on purpose. Meanwhile, the war on dust entered its mechanized phase, vacuum cleaners. But don't picture the sleek, cordless devices of today. Early vacuums were terrifying contraptions, heavy, loud, and often operated with a crank, bellows, or a gas-powered engine. One of the first models was horse-drawn. That's right. A cleaning machine pulled by horses, parked outside your home, with giant tubes snaked through the windows. It looked more like a fire brigade responding to a flower explosion than a cleaning service. These early machines didn't suck, they blew. Literally. They blew dust into bags. Sometimes they just rearranged filth. But upper-class households loved the idea of not having to beat their carpets like enemies anymore, so the vacuum cleaner stayed. By the 1920s and 30s, electric versions had arrived, heavy enough to crush a small child but glamorous enough to advertise in women's magazines. Next up, disinfectants. Once germ theory took off, cleanliness became moral. A clean house meant a clean soul. An unwashed counter? A gateway to disease and social ruin. Companies responded with sprays, powders, and liquids promising to annihilate 99% of bacteria, without ever mentioning what the other 1% was doing. Bleach became the chemical of choice. Kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, everything got bleached. If it didn't corrode your lungs, it wasn't working. People wiped down banisters, scrubbed doorknobs, mopped tiles, and soaked toys. Grandmothers became domestic war generals, wielding bleach-soaked cloths like bayonets. Of course, housework didn't get easier, just more complicated. Now you weren't just cleaning what you could see, you were responsible for what you couldn't. Dust mites, pathogens, invisible grime. Your worth as a homemaker, and later, house husband, was tied to whether your floors were bacteria-free. Laundry also went nuclear. Washing machines joined the war, eventually replacing hand washing with top-loading metal beasts that rattled, leaked, and sometimes walked across the floor like possessed robots. Dryers soon followed, giving clothing that warm, baked cotton, scent while doubling as lint factories and fire hazards. People now cleaned on a schedule. Mondays for laundry, Tuesdays for floors, Wednesdays for dusting, Thursdays for bathrooms, Fridays for everything you forgot. Weekends were for polishing silver, crying quietly, and pretending you had free time. New inventions kept coming: feather dusters, floor polishers, electric mops, steam cleaners, air fresheners, carpet shampoos, and eventually robot vacuums. Tiny disc-shaped janitors that skittered around the room like futuristic bugs and politely ate your pet hair. But here's the twist. As cleaning got easier, expectations exploded. A home now had to be spotless, deodorized, and camera-ready. Dust became a personal failure. Cleaning turned into performance art. Martha Stewart became a household deity, and magazines published spreads of real kitchens where not a single crumb dared exist. Meanwhile, entire industries sprouted around cleaning advice. Books, infomercials, YouTube channels, Instagram reels. People cleaned their homes for the internet, then cleaned them again so they could film themselves cleaning. Cleaning became content. And still, we struggle. The war on filth never ends. Dirt is eternal. It lurks beneath furniture, behind appliances, and deep in our existential anxiety. We invent better tools, smarter chemicals, quieter vacuums, but still get crumbs in the couch and toothpaste in the sink. So, the next time you sigh at a pile of laundry or fight the urge to scream at a sticky floor, remember this: once upon a time, people wiped their walls with animal fat, slept in straw mulch, and washed their linens in urine. You're doing great. Thanks for surviving this dusty journey with me. If your home feels a little cleaner just from listening, don't worry, it's a lie. The dust is still there. It always will be.